Hi YouTube. At this point I'd like to summarize what I found in the book of Revelation and who I think the authors were. First, I should break the book into parts. Part 1 I didn't cover at all. This is the first 5 chapters. It's highly Christian and highly dogmatic, and I saw no reason to address them because there didn't seem to be an obvious historical reference. Part 2 is the early author. He covers chapters 6 through 11. He's terribly precise, and he probably wrote these chapters somewhere around 81 CE, or possibly a bit later. Catholic traditional date holds that the entire book was written around 96 CE, but I can only accept this date for the early author. Chapters 12, 13, and 17 were likely written by the first author. However, those chapters were probably adjusted later. The adjustments were slight, but it appears that the second author was probably doing some kind of king counting. The only thing that truly does not fit with the first author is the 10 horns. Chapter 14 ends up being an enigma because it was ripped out of an early version of the Bar Kokhba revolt from 132 to 136. From this point on, it's difficult to tell how many people added to this book. The rest of the chapters 15, 16, and 18 through 22 appear to be a very late author, probably writing shortly after 193. This author simply does not have the skills of the previous author, and so his writings end up being vague and dogmatic, but there is an allegory in chapter 19 that appears to have been taken from the first author. That's the allegory of the heavenly warrior, which makes sense with chapter 12. I can say with almost complete certainty that this book could not have been completed until about 140 CE. That date would be under the assumption that much of the book is just a figurative guess, or that the author is really over-exaggerating some things. Now, it does appear that there is a high likelihood of later authorship, perhaps later than 193 CE. The connections in chapters 16 and 18 and the final chapters seem to point in that direction. While the author is using allegories to discuss real events, I believe there is fairly solid evidence that the allegories of the final chapters allude to events that include 193 CE. Now, besides trying to date the book, I was hoping to come up with likely authors. Unfortunately, I have 2 to address. The first author probably wrote around 81 CE. He's so precise that he couldn't have been too far from the eclipse event of 59. Too much later, and any written knowledge of that event would simply have been lost. And he may have been writing for a long time and simply completed it after 81. Now, the clue I think to the author's identity is who the traditionalists claim the guy was. Traditionally, he's claimed to be John of Patmos, who was supposedly sent into exile. However, we have another famous John who was sent into exile about this time, and this John was a real person. According to Josephus, John of Gischala was sent into exile after the fall of Jerusalem. This John was a zealot leader who caused a lot of problems for the Romans. The early author of Revelation seems to be purely Jewish, and it's likely that either John of Gischala wrote it himself, or it was attributed to John of Gischala by another scribe, essentially as a story of John of Gischala. At this point, I should mention the Catholic traditional date of 96 CE. Their evidence for this date is hearsay about hearsay. And though the date doesn't cause me too many problems, I think this section points to earlier authorship, probably not much later than the death of Titus in 81 CE. Now, there could have been multiple Christian authors adding to this, but I'm mostly looking for a completion date. As to the final author and the completion date, we have okay evidence that the book was in the hands of Irenaeus. He lived until about 202 CE and seems to take a somewhat scholarly approach to this book, even to the point of potentially correcting it. This book was likely completed somewhere between 193 and 200, and I believe the culprit I'm looking for on the authorship is probably Irenaeus himself. Some of his writings seem to be of scholarly interest, and he certainly gives the appearance of one who is capable of completing this book. There is a caveat to Irenaeus, and that is that most of his works have been altered later, so either Irenaeus is the prime suspect as the final author, or later additions to Irenaeus added revelation to his works. The reason why I find this idea a bit compelling is because Tertullian mentions much of the book of Revelation, and Tertullian ends up being a heretic steeped in prophecy of this exact type. It is possible that Tertullian completed the book, but later church fathers added revelation to Irenaeus to give the appearance of an earlier understanding of this book. The later church fathers probably didn't like Tertullian too much, and Eusebius was certainly trying to create a church history that predated all the heretical religions. So either Irenaeus or Tertullian probably completed this book, and I'd lean heavily toward Irenaeus, with the caveat that if Irenaeus was altered, Tertullian is definitely a likely culprit to be the final author. Tertullian seems a bit more nutty and far more philosophical than Irenaeus, so there's a certain appeal to the idea of Tertullian being the final author. That's it for my Decrypting Revelation series. For the most part, outside a few tangents I went on, I was real happy with the way it turned out. I may revisit some of these episodes later, mainly for corrections, but it's been fun and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks a lot, folks. Bye.